I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll look at the siege of Mariupol, accusations of Russia using chemical weapons, and the latest impact of the conflict on the economies of Russia and Ukraine.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's April 12th, day 48. And today, I'm joined by Venetia Rainey, Assistant Foreign Editor, Louise Moon, our Business Features Editor, and Francis Dearnley, Assistant Comment Editor. I started by asking Venetia for the latest news from Mariupol, where fierce Ukrainian resistance against overwhelming firepower may be reaching its endgame.
So what we're seeing is a continuation of what we've been seeing over the last few weeks. The situation is really desperate there, but we might finally see the city actually fall in the next few days. The bombardment has continued, and what we heard yesterday was reports of a chemical attack, and this came from the leader of a pro-Russia separatist area in the Donbass, suggesting that maybe chemical weapons should just be used to finish the city off. Lovely language. But then we also had the Azov Brigade, which many of our listeners will remember is a quite controversial brigade that contains neo-Nazi elements, first formed back in 2014 when fighting first broke out in the east of Ukraine. They're some of the people who've been left the longest in Mariupol still fighting. There's sort of a hardcore battalion there, along with some others who we'll be talking about in a bit. They said yesterday that there had been a chemical attack in the city. It's been impossible to verify this. We haven't had any confirmation from the Ukrainian government. The British government is also looking into it. The latest reports suggest that possibly not. But the Azov Brigade, the same people, have said again this morning, they've shared a video showing some of their members suffering some sort of mild symptoms, including sort of swelling and struggling to breathe, looking quite ill. It's quite a tricky video to verify, and it's impossible to say whether it was caused by a chemical attack. You know, they say in the video that the effects are quite mild because they were quite far from the centre of where the chemical weapons were dropped, and that they can't get any closer because of the fighting. It's impossible for us to verify any of this kind of stuff, really, and the latest signs is that that's not what's happened, but it is something that we're still looking at closely. The other big story out of Mariupol is that we're starting to see some people surrender. As listeners will know, there's been no food, no water, no electricity, and no ammunition that's been able to get in for a very long time now, over a month. So the fighters that have been left there, and there is also a sort of international regiment within the Ukrainian Marines that's been fighting there. They have been holding on for as long as they can, but we got word from a British fighter who we've been speaking to, a volunteer soldier. His call name is Johnny. His real name is Aidan Iceland. We've done a few stories on him, which you'll be able to find on the Telegraph's website, about how he's been fighting. He felt it was his duty to go there and fight, but he got word out through intermediaries of his who run his social media accounts that they've had to surrender. Him and his whole unit have had to surrender because they've run out of food and they've run out of ammo, and they said that they're going to surrender to the Russians in the hope that they'll get better treatment than if they get caught by the Chechens, for example. And we don't know what's going to happen next to them. That would mean that they're a prisoner of war, technically. Could be the first British prisoner of war, though there may have been others captured before that we don't know about. Obviously, we've heard all the reports about what Russians do with people that they capture in the areas around Kiev that have been liberated in the last 2 weeks, but we don't know what will happen to these soldiers. But that's the latest of what's happening in Mariupol so far.
Thanks, Venetia. Francis, I don't know if you want to come in on that at all.
I would just reiterate what Venetia was saying about the horrors that we've already heard snippets about in Mariupol, and would point readers to a really fascinating piece in the New York Times today, where we've already talked about Bucha and the atrocities that appear to have been committed there. What they've done is they've spent the last few days looking at the bodies that were found there, left there by the Russian retreat, and have been tracing what appears to have happened to them. They've interviewed people still in the area and have effectively recorded their stories and their last moments, and have mapped that, and have obviously all of this material will, we hope, one day be able to be used in some sort of future trial of some of the participants and for war crimes. But the reason this is relevant to Mariupol is, of course, once we hope we're able to see inside that city when this war is over, I think we can expect horrors that are considerably worse than we have seen thus far in this conflict. Already President Zelensky has pointed to the fact there may be as many as 10,000 dead in that city. That's certainly what the mayor of Mariupol believes. I mean, if that is true, then, as I said yesterday on the podcast, the numbers concerned there are, I think, comparable in the duration of time, if not considerably higher, than those suffered by London and other cities in Britain during World War II. And so it's a terrible tragedy that is occurring right now, and I think that many of us have not fully appreciated that and woken up to that because, of course, we're not able to have access to photographs and to that information. And one day when we do, I think we will perhaps wake up and realise that we have all been essentially witnessing one of the worst crimes on European soil ever committed, and comparable with any of the worst atrocities committed by the Soviets in the 20th century. It's 82 years this year since the Katyn massacre, which many listeners will be familiar, was the Soviet assassination of 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals in the years of the Second World War, and prior to it, as part of a liquidation of that class that could have threatened or perceived to have threatened the Soviets. It was discovered by the Nazis when they seized Poland in the war, and to this day is a stain on the Russian state that only in the years after the Soviet Union admitted that they had participated in those massacres. But the reason I think it's relevant, apart from just pointing to the scale of the horrors, is that once again we are seeing a rewriting of history taking place in Russia at present on relation to the Katyn massacre, where they are now beginning to deny again that it was ever something committed by the Soviets, and that in reality it was something committed by the Nazis. We were meant to have turned a page in our history, in Europe's history, where some of these horrific crimes were, states had admitted to them, and we were able to find some solace in that and try and learn the lessons. But as with so many areas of this conflict, we seem to have gone horribly back in time.
Can we just put Mariupol in a bit of strategic context? We have talked about this before, but if it's true that we're on the eve of the city falling to Russian forces, why is this important? How does this change the war?
So it's all part of Russia's efforts to try and create this land bridge to Crimea, which it annexed back in 2014. It has been waging a relentless war on these cities in the south to try and create that land bridge from the Russian border leading down to Crimea Peninsula down in the south. And Mariupol is the sort of last holdout of that. They do occupy territory around it, so it feels almost as if it's become punitive, and we have seen suggestions of that previously, that Vladimir Putin doesn't like the idea that Mariupol stood up to him back in 2014. The Russians took the city for a few months and then the Ukrainians won it back, and now he wants to, wipe it off the face of the earth effectively, because that land bridge is sort of there. They could drive around Mariupol, but they want to be able to go right through the main road that goes through Mariupol. And the sort of other cities that are part of that offensive in the south is Melitopol, which you'll have heard about, and Berdyansk as well. And the idea is that's the sort of southern war front, but what we're also seeing is columns of troops and armoured vehicles and tanks coming down from the area around Kharkiv. So Izium has been taken in recent weeks. We heard about the attack on the railway station in Kramatorsk. That's all part of this sort of pincer movement that we're seeing to try and seal off the Donbass area so that Russia can claim some sort of victory in this war and take a bit more territory. And that's backed up by what we're seeing, the sort of repositioning of Russian troops both within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine in Russia. We've seen a massive convoy heading on the Russian side of the border, heading towards Donbass. So they're clearly aiming to reinforce that as quickly as possible. And that war for the Donbass is very much underway already.
Thanks, Venetia. Before we bring Louise in and talk a little bit about the latest impact on the Russian and Ukrainian economies, can we talk a little bit about this story that Putin has thrown a top spy chief into prison? I mean, we've seen a lot of fallout from the first few weeks of the war. This seems to be in Russia in terms of repression and this sort of thing. So what's going on here? What happened? Francis, do you want to speak to this?
Sure, David. Well, as you say, very senior, effectively his top spy chief has been, we believe, and I should say that this is unconfirmed, what I'm about to say regarding the numbers of other, believe, intelligence officers who've also been thrown into prison. But yes, he is the top spy chief in charge of much of the intelligence prior to the invasion, so we understand. And we hear that maybe as many more as 100 agents have been removed from their jobs. And as I say, he would have been the head of the department on Ukraine. Now, I think I've just made an allusion to one of the worst Stalinist crimes, which was the Katyn massacre. But this is, I think, in some ways comparable philosophically, if not in terms of the numbers concerned, of the kind of purges that were very, very common in the Russian state in the Soviet era, where effectively to fail is not to, as in the West, to lose one's job or to be moved on, but is essentially to be seen as a traitor to the state. And as a consequence of that, you are thrown into prison, you use your rights, and sometimes, indeed, you would face, most commonly in the Soviet era, face execution. And what was so barbaric about this practice as well is that quite often people were forced to sign confessions and that their families would then, in the hope that their families would then be spared. I mean, this is truly horrific stuff. And the fact that Putin, as we've already talked previously of several weeks ago on this podcast, was talking about the spitting out of flies and how this conflict would expose the traitors within Russia, that kind of fierce rhetoric and rhetoric relating to purges, really. We're starting to see evidence of that from within his own effectively government and administration. We already knew it was happening among the opposition, of course, within Russia. Alexei Navalny is currently in prison, the main opposition leader, and of course free journalism has been silenced, and all of the with Ukraine being used as the justification for that. But this is something, I think, different when you are essentially sending a message to your own subordinates that failure is not an option, that if you are that if you fail, then you will face prison and possibly worse. And again, I think this is something that we should be sensitive to in the grand strategic picture, as it were, that all of these individuals who are, in a sense, complicit in the crimes taking place in Ukraine are essentially being forced to put up or shut up. And that will make it very, very difficult to really challenge Putin from within the regime. This is a tried and tested strategy of remaining in power, and unfortunately, if one looks at the historical precedents, a very successful one.
Yeah, just quickly to add to that, because we've seen today that one of the other opposition figures in Russia, and there aren't many for the reasons that we've just heard, a guy called Vladimir Karmazov, who some of our listeners may have heard of before, has also been arrested. He was poisoned twice previously and survived, obviously, but he's now been arrested, and it's not clear exactly why, but he was on TV yesterday describing the Kremlin as a regime of murderers and saying that he had no doubt that the Putin regime would end its war in Ukraine, but that it wouldn't be happening anytime soon. that's another thing to keep an eye on, because, as we say, there aren't many opposition figures, but they're dwindling even faster at the moment.
Thanks, Venetia, and thanks, Francis. Louise Moon, we saw a story yesterday in The Telegraph that Russian consumers have slashed their spending by up to a tenth. What does this tell us about Russia's economy? And is there anything else we should know?
I think this is basically one of the first indications of the deep recession that Russia is facing. So I kind of mentioned before, I'm not sure if you heard it, but that economists have been expecting a 2-year recession and a surge in job losses due to sanctions. That's been expected for a while. But essentially, Russian consumers have been slashing spending by a tenth. So that was data that was at the start of April from Sberbank, which is Russia's largest lender, and compared to the same time last year. And that comes as households are basically buying things that their purchases are plunging at the fastest rate since late 2020. So it's just basically a stark indication of how this is really affecting the economy and really going down into the households. And also, so at the beginning of the war, spending had increased in the first few weeks, but that in part was due to panic buying. And it was quite interesting. Putin's former chief economic advisor said in an interview that the number of Russians living in poverty, which is currently estimated at about 20 million, he thinks that could double or triple. So it's really just one of the first indications we've seen of what's expected really in the future of the Russian economy. And just quickly to add as well, there was quite an interesting report yesterday that we did on the first Russian company to default. They've actually come out today insisting that they haven't defaulted, and they blamed the process for holding up their funds. But the story, I mean, whether or not that is true, if they have paid off their debts, but it was Russian Railways, which is a state-owned company, and they were ruled to have defaulted because they failed to make a payment to investors. And as I said, they have insisted that hasn't happened, but that confusion and whether or not it's slightly unclear of whether they are in default. They were ruled to be in default yesterday, but that confusion is, again, kind of the latest sign that sanctions are hammering the economy. They would have been the first Russian company to default, and it kind of reignites the debate of whether or not Russia itself will default on sovereign bonds. Scrutiny is rising over that. And I know that we've addressed that in the podcast before. That has been a discussion topic for quite a while. But as consumers are spending less, as companies are doing worse, the economy is faring a lot worse, and therefore scrutiny is rising as to whether this will happen soon.
I think Mutaz made a really interesting point on the podcast yesterday in relation to the impact of sanctions when he said, I think he was talking about Sudan, which he is a country he's familiar with the history of, that normally when you have sanctions, as has happened with this conflict, people are quite defiant. They think that they are temporary, and as a consequence that their businesses will be able to reopen, or that the value of their currency will eventually stabilise. And then, as the war goes on, that usually the resistance hardens even further, until at some point there is a tipping point, and that can take months or it can take years, where people suddenly do wake up to the reality and the impact that sanctions have on a nation. And of course, we don't know yet how long these sanctions will go on for. We do know that Putin has, as part of these ongoing negotiations with Ukraine, has said that any future deal will have to have the easing of sanctions as part of any arrangements that are made. I think the West will be very opposed to doing that until whilst Putin remains in power. But even so, it's, I think, a very relevant point, that at some point the Russian people are going to really start feeling the long-term impact of these sanctions. And whilst in the short term it may harden their resolve, in the long term, if one looks at the historical trends, there is a sort of revulsion against them at some stage. And I think this speaks to one of the great challenges, as I say, that the West and Ukraine will have in the coming months and years, is to what extent to try and bring Russia back into the fold, or perhaps out of necessity. If with Russian gas and oil, etc., will the sanctions have to be eased? It's a very uncomfortable question, but one I think we know are being discussed at very high levels behind closed doors, both within Russia and within the Western powers.
Just to add to that, if you don't mind, Francis touched on oil and gas, and this has been quite a sticking point. Throughout the whole war, but also now in particular, because there's been, I think we're going to touch on it in a bit, but the World Bank report in terms of Russia's economy and all these things that we've mentioned today, just to show how badly it is faring. But at the same time, Europe is essentially, you could say, essentially helping to stem or to prop up kind of the remaining parts of Russia's economy. I mean, it could be faring even worse than it is, and they're always kind of cushioning the blow because they haven't sanctioned oil and gas. And I think that's just it's a key sticking point that they're not going so far as to do that, because it will affect them so much. And the advisor that I mentioned earlier, he said in an interview with the BBC, he said that because Europe is continuing to buy oil and gas, he's essentially arguing they need to reduce their reliance because they're helping the economy, and they could be having a lot more of an impact, but obviously that comes with big economic hit to themselves.
Thanks, Louise. And yes, you brought up the World Bank report. Could you tell us a little bit about this? Because it was looking at Russia's economy this year, but also Ukraine's, which I'd quite like us to speak about a little bit, the impact of this war on Ukraine.
Yes, of course. So on Sunday, the World Bank came out with a report, and they said, so if we start off with Russia, they said that Russia's economy, so its GDP, would fall by 11.2%. And that comes in the face of, obviously, as we discussed, in terms of sanctions, an exodus of capital, soaring inflation. And it's quite stark. A previous forecast predicted that GDP was going to grow 3% this year. So it just shows how much of an impact these sanctions and the war has had on Russia. And last year, it expanded by 4.7%. So again, just shows the impact. And at the same time, I mean, that in itself sounds bad, 11.2%. But Ukraine is predicted to collapse by 45.1%. So last month, the IMF had actually predicted that Ukraine would have a downturn of 10 to 35%. Obviously, that's quite a wide range, but 10 to 35%. And now the World Bank is saying 45%. So, I mean, as you say, Ukraine's economy is being completely ravaged, essentially, by this war. The World Bank, so those were, I think I'm right in saying that those were the median predictions. A more pessimistic scenario predicts a 20% decline for Russia and a 75% one for Ukraine. So that's extreme case, strong scenario. So as we've discussed, I mean, this is completely wrecking both economies and even worse for Ukraine.
Francis, I know you had some thoughts on this as well, in particular to do with Britain offering import tax relief. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, just to pick up on what Louise was saying, I think, I remember at the very start of this conflict, there was a good line that somebody wrote, which was that effectively Putin had managed to destroy two countries in the space of a week. And that is now, of course, being only underlined by the scale of the economic devastation, both within Russia and within Ukraine. But yes, just on this point about Britain, we are essentially, the Prime Minister has said that he is removing import tax. So this basically on Ukrainian goods. So basically it will be cheaper for Ukrainian goods to be sold and purchased within the United Kingdom. And of course it would be a small gesture because we don't import that much from Ukraine. But this will be something I think that we will begin to see as a trend across Western economies as Ukraine is essentially trying to repair the damage caused by this devastating war. Countries want to extend their hand, and one of the ways in which they can do that, aside from offering weapons and munitions, is to give them economic support through encouraging free trade and other means. And I think, as a general, assuming that there is a an end to this war that allows Ukraine to have its independence, and for President Zelensky to remain in power, then I think we will see Ukraine really come much, much closer into the European fold. I don't necessarily mean the European Union in that, because I think that there are some issues that will have to be ironed out in relation to the Ukrainian membership, although I'm sure that it will be expedited, that process. We've already seen the start of that. But I think, generally speaking, Ukraine has become emblematic of a greater existential fight within Europe about freedom and about values that we thought essentially had been won in the Cold War. And as a consequence of this conflict has shown that is not the case, that these values are still to be fought for and cherished. And in a sense, it gives Europe some meaning again, I think. And as a consequence of that, I think we will see Ukraine supported and become a much more vital component to what we see as Europe. And I think that this will have, as I say, very big ramifications, because traditionally, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, Ukraine was seen as more part of the East than as part of the West. I don't think that one can say that now. And I think that will have a big influence on that whole region in ways that perhaps yet we are not yet able to predict.
Talking about countries that are shifting their allegiance, or at least moving closer to the West, can we talk a little bit about Sweden and Finland and their moves closer to NATO? I mean, it's a story that's been going on for the past few days, but I realise we haven't actually spoken about it here. Venetia and Francis, what's going on?
So, yeah, obviously two countries with slightly different histories in terms of their relationship with Russia, but have been moving ever since the invasion broke out. There has been discussion about whether they might join NATO, and that's something that was seen as really improbable. This time last year, polling about whether it was important to join the alliance was very low. There just wasn't support for it. It wasn't seen as an urgent issue. Russia wasn't seen as an immediate threat. But all of that has changed. We're now seeing Finland debate whether they should do it. Sweden is having the same sorts of discussions at very high levels. That's quite a seismic sort of reordering of Europe as well. It's partly to do with Russia invading Ukraine, but it's also partly to do with the sort of rebalancing of what's going on in the Baltic area. Russia has stationed a lot of troops in Belarus, which is something we've spoken about before, and that shifts the power dynamics in that part of Northern Europe. It makes the Baltic states, which are quite small, feel a lot more worried, and it also opens the door for, more troops to potentially be posted in Kaliningrad, this Russian enclave, which is facing the sort of waters towards Sweden and Finland. So it's all part of this sort of reshuffling of the power dynamics that we've seen in the last few years being reshuffled in real time over the last few weeks. We might see NATO get a new member sometime this year, next year. We'll see.
Thanks, Venetia. Just one more update I think we should cover. It's in the Telegraph's live blog of the Ukraine war this morning. It's a story that we've picked up. A British missile sent in secret to Ukraine appears to have shot down a Russian drone. Can you tell us a little bit about this story, and why was it secret? Why didn't we know about this before?
I'll happily pick that up. I mean, I think that it's another example of the kind of very high-level weapon support that has been offered to the Ukraine by not only Britain but the West more generally. And of course, we only hear what the government tells us we can report, and this is an example of where some of the weapons that we are only learning about now that we have sent, but also what the Russians have used. Many listeners will recall when we were speaking several weeks ago about some mysterious Russian artillery weaponry, I believe it was, that had never been seen before, and it seemed to have the capability of jamming defense weaponry, so that the missiles would jam the tracking being used by defenders, and that would then mean that the missiles were able to land and score targets more successfully. So again, this is what wars do, is that of course all great powers are developing technology in warfare all of the time. We often don't see what is going on in that development, and yet warfare brings it all out, and we are seeing that on both sides. I think it's also, just when we're talking about the British military strategy, some very interesting remarks by James Heapy, who's the minister sort of in charge of the armed forces. He made some very interesting remarks, I think, about the sort of longer term strategy for Ukraine, but also saying that effectively Ukrainian soldiers will be being flown over here to be trained to use some of these advanced weapons and also tanks as well. And I think he also made a comment, something we talked about at the very beginning, about this issue around the use of chemical warfare by Vladimir Putin's forces. He has said that if that does happen, that nothing will be off the table. Now, I think that's a very noteworthy remark to have made because, of course, we were very critical and the West was very critical early on, particularly with regard to America's and Joe Biden's strategy with regard to saying what America and the West wouldn't be willing to do, and essentially marking where the red lines were before, so that, making it much easier for Putin to be able to predict and to essentially say, well, I can risk doing this because it would appear that there is no appetite within the West to resist. If I use this kind of weapon or if I use siege warfare, etc. Now it seems that there is a more deliberate policy, at least coming out of Britain, that doesn't make what our red lines are so clear, and that makes it much more difficult when for an enemy who is having to be making calculations all the time about the likely manoeuvres of rivals. So I think it's just an interesting shift, I think.
Thanks, Francis. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention, Louise and Venetia?
Yeah, just quickly, there's some quite interesting weapons donations and sort of, that kind of on the military front developments that maybe we should quickly mention. Slovakia is in talks to give some Soviet-era fighter jets, MiGs, to Ukraine. That would be a huge deal. The reason they're giving these Soviet-era fighter jets is because that's what Ukrainian pilots are already trained to fly. And that would be a huge development for Ukraine. They've been asking for fighter jets for a long time, and that's the kind of heavy weaponry that they say that they need to win this next stage of the war in the Donbass. We've also seen the UK saying today that it's going to offer training to Ukrainian troops for its armoured vehicles. So the Ukrainian troops will be coming here to the UK and be given training. They'll be coming in the next few days. Also quite significant. And then, so that missile that we were talking about earlier, I just wanted to give a bit more detail on that. So a Martlet laser-guided missile, and it's quite sort of high-tech. It can be, air to surface, surface to surface, or surface to air, which is what it was in this case, and it took down a drone. And obviously we've seen in the last few weeks it's sort of missile system, if you will, called Starstreak, taking down a Russian helicopter. So it's just an example of the sort of equipment and weaponry that we're starting to see going over into Ukraine that is clearly having a significant impact. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the weeks to come as the discussions around sanctions, as we were talking about earlier, to do with energy policy become trickier and trickier. A way to sort of balance that need to continue supporting Ukraine in a material way might be heavier and heavier weaponry.
Just on the weaponry point, I read a really interesting piece of commentary by Phillips O'Brien, who's the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews, and indeed he's actually going to write for us online today, so keep an eye out for that on the Telegraph website. Essentially, he makes some very interesting comparisons with the casualty rates suffered in many famous campaigns in the 20th century and beyond, and those being currently experienced by the Russian forces. So essentially, his argument is that the Russian casualty rates of around 30% are comparable with some of the worst losses in the First World War and also the American Civil War, which will be very familiar for our listeners across the pond. So actually starting with the US Civil War, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, of course, on the losing side in that conflict, but still considered one of the most successful generals in that war. His troops suffered around 20% casualties on their campaigns. And as I say, he was the losing general in that war. In the Battle of the Somme in 1916, in the First World War, as I say, the numbers there are around 30%. So the British, French and Germans deployed around 3.5 million soldiers and lost about 1.5 million in casualties. But that battle, interestingly, lasted more than 3 months. So in order to get up to the 30% casualty threshold, whilst, of course, that's twice the length of time of the conflict so far. So that speaks just to the extent of the losses that Russia are currently suffering. Another interesting comparison that he makes is with the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The reason I mention that one, I think, is because it's been talked about in relation to the battle that we're now going to start seeing in the Donbass between traditional tanks and infantry-style warfare, particularly tanks. Kursk was the biggest tank battle in history. And interestingly, in that battle, the German losses, there was a defeat for the Germans, was around 22%. So again, even though that was a devastating defeat for the Germans, their casualty rate was actually lower than those currently being experienced by the Russian forces. So this is the two significant areas for this in terms of the long-term strategy for the Russians is, of course, that the first is that when you face losses on this scale, you almost certainly will have to cease operations for a period of time and recover. Britain certainly did that after the failed Somme offensive in 1916. And so I think that we are perhaps seeing that regraping now before the renewed assault on the Donbass that we are expecting, although it may well be that it will be a longer pause will be required if those initial assaults are not successful. But secondly, and more concerningly, of course, it means that I think in terms of the strategy being considered by Russia's generals, that you do not want to be risking soldiers in hand-to-hand or close quarters warfare, and it increases the likelihood of chemical warfare perhaps being used, and let's hope not. But it's a very serious concern, I think, and something that we should be sensitive to. And so I think it's right to talk about it, because these are the kind of calculations that will be being made when you are facing such staggeringly high casualty rates when looking back historically on defeated armies.
Thanks very much, Francis. So I think we've reached the end of our time. So Louise, Francis and Venetia, can I have your final thoughts, please? What should people be looking to in the days ahead?
I think in terms of business and the economy, I think any more companies defaulting in Russia, as this will be quite an indication of the health of the Russian economy and kind of where it falls in terms of the wide predictions of how far its economy is going to decline, as we spoke about earlier. So I think that'll be the key thing as an indication of how hit their economy is going to be.
On the ground in Ukraine, I think it's all about watching what happens in Mariupol, how quickly it falls, what the Russians are trying to cover up about what they've done there, and how soon we can get in and see what's actually been happening. And then, of course, the battle for the Donbass, which, as I said, is already underway.
My final thought would just be to flag, I think, that another horror of this war, and any war really, is it that distracts the world from other horrors that are taking place. We've talked previously about some of the other international incidents that perhaps precipitated this war, not least the chaotic evacuation from Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Taliban have recently been committing numerous executions and treating women in particularly appallingly, which they had promised not to do when they seized power in Afghanistan. And I think it's just, as I say, Ukraine is very different in terms of its geopolitical consequences, and we're very much right to be focusing on that. But as I say, it gives also a blank check to terrible regimes around the world, because they know that the world is not currently watching them. And there are a lot of bad things going on that will have, huge ramifications, not just in Afghanistan, but also the Iran nuclear deal, which I think would be being scrutinized much more closely were it not for what's going on in Ukraine. And I think, that this is something that we should at least be sensitive to, that it is yet another unintended and horrific consequence of war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louise Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.